The second speaker is Luigi Ladisa. Sorry, Ladisa. Sorry. Luigi is in charge of a fabulous blog called London Nerd, and he is also in a way the documentaries of this conference, since we owe to him the filming of the conference at Boulogne, and also the filming of today's conference. So thank you, Luigi. The floor is yours.
Thank you. On September 16, 1824, Richard Baker went to his lawyers to make changes to his will. At the age of 60, he was a shrewd businessman who lived at Barron House, near the village of Ancestry, about 50 miles north of London. Everything was good, indeed very good. The bank account was more than prosperous, the horses gave him satisfaction, and his cellar was full of fine wines. It was time to put the icing on the cake. He was going to rewrite his will to leave much of his possessions to his 3-year-old grandson, a child with blue eyes and red hair, who had been given his own name, Richard. Once he reached the lawyer's office, as he got out of the carriage, Richard Baker suffered a heart attack and died. That's how his grandson, Richard Francis Burton, at the age of 3, lost a fortune, £80,000 of 1824. We probably wouldn't be here today if he had inherited all that money. Perhaps Richard Francis Burton would have led the existence of the perfect country gentleman like his grandfather. He would have raised dogs and horses, paid for the rebuilding of the parish church choir. He would have been buried with many honors and forgotten in a few years. Instead, Richard Baker's money went all the way to Richard Jr., the son from his first marriage. Richard Francis Burton was born in Torquay on March 19, 1821. Some sources speak of Ancestry, confusing the place of birth with the one where he was baptized, that is the parish frequented by his maternal grandparents. His mother, Martha, was one of 3 daughters of Richard Baker and a Scottish thoroughbred, a direct descendant of Rob Roy MacGregor, the legendary clan leader and outlaw. Little Richard Francis' red hair probably came from the ancestors of his maternal grandmother. His father, Joseph Netherville Burton, born in Ireland, was a military man with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had met his future wife while on leave in England. Old Baker, with great insight, had found a way to secure the £30,000 dowry for his daughter. He even tried to get in the way of the wedding, but he couldn't. He had in fact sensed that his son-in-law was a potential danger. He had squandered his share of Irish inheritance in a short time by investing in the stock market, and now relied only on his military salary. Recklessness in financial matters was a characteristic of the Burtons. His older brother, Edmund, had squandered his inheritance to the last penny and had been forced to emigrate to Canada. Edmund and Joseph were the eldest sons of Edward, rector of Tuam in the Irish county of Galway, who was born in England and had moved to Ireland following his brother, also a churchman. They were from Shep, Westmoreland. At Tuam, Edward had married Maria Margareta Campbell, and the couple had settled in a house called New Garden. His wife was the daughter of the Vicar General of Tuam. There is no doubt that Richard Francis Burton was a prolific writer. What is surprising is the fact that amongst the thousands of pages in which he described his extraordinary life, he dedicated only a handful of lines to his mother and just a few more to his father. There are no portraits or drawings of either. The reason for the poor consideration for his mother probably lies in the fact that he believed she was responsible for the lost inheritance from his grandfather, because she had insisted that he did not disinherit the half-brother to whom she was very close. Richard Francis Burton probably had a bad opinion of his father's professional background. He had chosen a military career at 17 to leave Ireland and escape a bleak and oppressive future. The army had immediately transferred him to Italy, more precisely to Sicily, which was then a bulwark of the British resistance against Napoleon. The island had been occupied since 1806, and Lord Bentinck, the Crown's representative, had settled in Palermo. Burton's love for Italy, where he would eventually move with his family, was born during this time. After Sicily, it was the turn of Genoa. During his stay, Queen Caroline, wife of King George IV, arrived in the city with a court of capricious ladies and gallant men. Burton's father was part of the contingent of troops that controlled the city, and years later, when the Queen was accused by his husband of adultery with an Italian man, the colonel was called by the prosecution to testify. Burton did not show up because the Queen had won his devotion and that of the other officers who considered her innocent. The consequence of this refusal was harsh. He was placed on half pay by order of the Duke of Wellington himself. From that moment on, Joseph Netherby Burton lost all ties to the army and stopped working forever. It was 1820. The year before, he had met and married Martha Baker. Richard Francis Burton would be born the following year in Turkey. Here, his father, perhaps too lazy or perhaps simply unable to put aside pride and return to duty, devoted whole days to his chemistry experiments. When money ran out and creditors knocked on the door, the Burtons packed the bags and moved to the continent, first to France and then, as mentioned, to Italy. It was 1825 and little Richard Francis had just turned 4. Exactly 40 years later, in the early days of 1865, Captain Burton, together with his wife Isabel, with whom he had been married for 4 years, left for a journey that would prove less adventurous than those he had previously made, but equally important. The couple sailed from the English coast to Ireland, the birthplace of Burton's father. At that time, Richard was on leave after completing his consular duties in Fernando Po and was waiting to depart for Santos, Brazil. This was one of the rare occasions in the early years of their marriage when Burton and his wife spent weeks together, taking advantage of the consul's leave. On January 10, 1865, the Eastern Travellers, as the Dublin Evening Mail called them, walked through the doors of the Burton Hotel in Dublin's Sackville Street, today O'Connell Street. The following days were very intense. On January 14, they were among the guests of a reception by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Woodhouse, in the splendid Viceregal Lodge, now the residence of the Irish President. The following day, they attended a religious service. On February 2nd, they moved from the Bilton to the Gresham Hotel, and on the 8th, they were among the guests at the first ball of the season in the beautiful St. Patrick's Hall, inside Dublin Castle. On February 16, they were hosted at Moor Abbey by the Marquis of Drogheda, and the following evening they were again at dinner with Lord Woodhouse. If I close my eyes, I can imagine the expression of suffering on the face of Captain Burton, forced by his wife's insistence to face these social occasions. Elegant, well-behaved, a perfect example of a Victorian high society woman, Isabel Burton was perfectly at ease among dances, receptions, and religious services. Her husband, on the contrary, was intolerant of all this, but endured for love. The second part of the trip to Ireland, which started on February 20 with the departure from the Gresham Hotel, is certainly more interesting. What had begun as a vacation became for Burton an exploration of his roots. They travelled in a jaunting car, a typical Irish two-wheeled carriage, pulled by a single horse that in the middle of the day had his meal with a pint of water and whiskey. They toured Ireland far and wide. They visited Tara Hill, Drogheda, the site of the famous Battle of Boyne, Armagh Cathedral, kissed the stone of Blarney, and admired the beauty of Killarney on the Atlantic coast. Then they moved on to Tuam, the birthplace of his father. Joseph Netherby Burton had never spoken about his origins, and after his marriage never set foot in Ireland. Tuam turned out to be a total disappointment. Isabel writes that they both found it a dreadful place. The name of the Burtons was still well known thanks to the memory of his grandfather and great-uncle. Hundreds of poor people gathered around Richard and Isabel begging for gifts. The couple dined with some old aunts and left immediately without stopping for the night, much to Isabel's relief. It was time to return to Dublin. Quotes, "On to Dublin, dear and dirty, dear indeed and very dear, with its claret at 8 shillings, little better than small beer. O thou capital of Ireland, what fear questions roll, as I am to thee a stranger over my quasi-Irish soul." End of quotes. These verses were written by Richard Francis Burton and are part of an incomplete poem. When they returned to the capital, Burton wrote to a gentleman he had met several times during the social occasions they had attended in Dublin. His name was John Bernard Burke. He was a few years older than him and held the post of Ulster King of Arms. The King of Arms was in charge of the heralds and had the task of guarding the coats of arms and of registering and correcting the family trees. Burke was also the custodian of the archives of Dublin Castle, his office being in the massive record tower, and was later appointed Keeper of Irish State Documents. He published the prestigious Burke's Peerage, founded in 1826, the guide that periodically updated the family status of aristocrats of United Kingdom. For Burton, interested in knowing his origins, it was the ideal interlocutor. The biography written by Lady Burton recounts that one day she and her husband were guests of Burke and his wife, and that in the study of the famous genealogist, an interesting conversation took place on the roots of Captain Burton and the so-called legend of Louis XIV. Before I can talk about it, I need to mention my recent trip to Ireland. I arrived in Dublin and in the company of my wife, just like Burton. The similarities end here because the goals of our holidays were different. In random order, walking along the Dingle Way on the Atlantic coast, Guinness, listening to live music, Guinness, admiring sheep as far as the eye can see, and again, Guinness. No carriages, but only trains and buses, no receptions or dances, just cheerful evenings in the delicious pubs of the villages we crossed. But Sylvia and I also started and closed our trip to Ireland from Dublin, because from there Ryanair would take us back to Italy. Back in the capital, after a week immersed in nature, a little magic happened, and one of those coincidences that must be attributed to old Captain Burton. I had received an invitation from Mick Walton for the Vienna conference, and during the outbound flight I had started reading some of the material collected in the previous days. The idea was already to use the trip to Ireland to deepen Burton's Irish roots. I had immediately discarded the idea of a visit to Tuam. There was no need to admire live a dreadful place. I concentrated rather on the good old Dublin and the meeting between Burton and Burke. I had persisted in wanting to discover Burke's residence in 1865 to know exactly where the meeting described by Lady Burton had taken place. Reading newspapers of the time, I discovered that the year before, Burke's address was 28 Pembroke Place in Baldbridge. The road seems to have disappeared in the following years. In 1865, Pembroke Place was in fact incorporated into Pembroke Road with the subsequent renumbering of houses. Burke's home was assigned number 55, and since then everything has remained the same. The magic happened when I googled. 55 Pembroke Road is still in place, and incredible but true, it is a private house open to the public from May to September. Could I not contact the owner to arrange a visit? At 12 o'clock on Sunday, August 13, Sylvia and I were in front of the massive door painted green to which one day Captain Burton and his wife Isabel had knocked. Pembroke Villa, so it's called today, is part of a row of elegant Georgian houses built in 1835 by George Herbert, 11th Earl of Pembroke. The facade on Pembroke Road, stone on the lower floors and brick on the upper floors, is embellished by elegant iron railings and balustrades designed by Richard Turner, maker of the famous greenhouses of Kew Gardens in London. Some of the magnificent fireplaces of Pembroke Villa are also designed by him. So Michael Quinn, the current host, told us. Owner of pubs and hotels, fond of history, Quinn bought the building in 1995 and carefully restored it, bringing it back to its former glory. He led us inside the house, starting from the basement once occupied by the servants, and now inhabited by his nephews and the splendid golden retriever named Fionn. The actual visit began on the mezzanine floor, from which a wonderful staircase rises to the upper floors. That day it was flooded by the light that came in through the huge stained glass window. Sitting in the large living room on the first floor, Michael Quinn listened with interest to the main reason for our visit. We were there to find a trace of a passage of Captain Burton and his wife Isabel in the house that was once the residence of Sir John Bernard Burke. Unfortunately, during extensive research over the years to reconstruct the history of the building, Quinn had never crossed Burke's name. So he, Sylvia and I, tried to figure out the meeting between Burton and Burke in the early months of 1865. That evening, a carriage left the Burtons opposite 55 Pembroke Road. All the windows of the house were lit, and there was a huge chandelier on the first floor. They climbed the 13 steps leading to the entrance, from which the snow fallen in the afternoon had been cleared, and knocked at the door painted green. A young and petite maid came to open. She took their coats and led them upstairs, preceding them along the beautiful staircase. The maid knocked on the living room door and announced the arrival of Captain and Mrs. Burton. After the inevitable pleasantries, soon two couples formed. Lady Burke stayed in the drawing room with Isabel and introduced her to her children one by one, especially the last born, who was just 6 months old. The husbands instead went into the studio upstairs. Here, Burton began to tell the story of his family and the origin of his parents. In my veins flows English, Irish, Scottish and French blood, and probably also some drops coming from the East or from the Gypsies, even if this has never been proved. The genealogist listened carefully and in the meantime took notes. The Burke's peerage consultation, under the heading Burton, confirmed what the captain already knew. Unfortunately, in his bloodline there was a gap of almost 40 years from 1712 to 1750, which prevented to make a direct connection of the paternal family with a Sir Thomas Burton, named Baronet by James I. Burton expected this response and didn't seem disappointed. He put the glass of whiskey on the mantelpiece, gained the center of the room, and began to talk loudly, as if he was on a stage. My Scottish and Northern ancestors gave me the coolness and solidity in the most dangerous moments I face. From the Irish, I have the ability to beat myself. Of Arabs or Gypsies, the mastery of languages, my agnosticism, superstition, mysticism, wild spirit, and intuition. And then there is the legend of Louis XIV. At this point, Burke stopped writing, put down his pen, and looked at Burton, inviting him to continue. This legend is passed down from father to son in the Burton family. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had a son by a mistress, the Countess of Montmorency, and obviously did not recognize the baby. The woman was Huguenot, and fearful that the child would be raised Catholic, she sent him illegally to Ireland, hidden in a basket of flowers. Here he was adopted, changed his name from Louis le Jeune to Louis Drelincourt Young, and eventually became rector of the Anglican Church. Decades later, his granddaughter, Maria Margareta Campbell, married my grandfather. That is why my blood is also French, and for this reason I am an excellent fencer and everyone considers me witty and shrewd. I want to be clear, Burke said when Burton had finished. I wonder, Captain Burton, that you, who have such good Northern and Scottish blood in your veins, and are connected with so many of the best families, should trouble about what can only be a morganatic descent at best. Burton, leaning against the bookshelf with hands in his pockets, looked amused at Burke's serious face. "Why, I would rather be the bastard of the king than the son of a honest man." And saying so, bursting into a thunderous laughter which was heard throughout the house. Poor Burke remained baffled and could not find a suitable answer. The evening ended shortly after, with the last whiskey in front of the magnificent living room fireplace. When the carriage left Pembroke Villa for the Gresham Hotel, the bell of St. Mary's Church rang. It was midnight. Thousands of miles away, in Sicily, stands a church which is much older than St. Mary's. The Cathedral of Monreale, which dates back to 12,000, is famous for the beautiful Byzantine mosaics that decorate the interior, and in particular for the immense Christ Pantocrator depicted in the apse. The left bell tower is lower because it remained unfinished. On the dial of the clock there is a Latin inscription, the second part of a proverb that says, "Nocis meam tuam nescis." You know my time, but you do not know when yours will come. I already told you that Burton's father, who left his native town of Tuam after joining the army, had been sent to Sicily to defend the island from the threat of Napoleon. Monreale rises on the outskirts of Palermo, where Lord Bentinck, the representative of the crown, was installed. It is not excluded that one day the young soldier passed by and looked up at the bell tower of the cathedral to know what time it was. To his surprise, he would read the "Tuam nescis." As I said, in Latin, "Tuam nescis" means "you don't know yours." But it could also be translated as "you don't know Tuam" if you refer to the town in Galway County. Burton's father knew Tuam so well that he escaped and never set foot again. Who certainly did not know Tuam was his son, Captain Richard Francis Burton. The trip to Ireland was an opportunity to visit his father's birthplace, and the meeting with Burke confirmed what he already knew, that his parents had been mediocre, but that previous generation had been a little bit more interesting. The relationship with Rob Roy, the notorious Scottish outlaw, the descent from an English baronet made uncertain by a gap in the family tree, an intriguing but very questionable link with the Sun King. The only character out of the box, the man who was larger than life, was basically himself, Captain Burton. It was time to leave Dublin. The next stop was Santos, Brazil, then it would be Damascus, and finally Trieste. But something tells me that Captain Burton might still be around. I took a photograph last night at the restaurant here in Vienna. There was an interesting man who was enjoying a slice of sachertorte in the table on the corner. Does he remind you of anyone? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigi, for this captivating inquiry into the ancestry of Richard Burton, and also for giving us a glimpse of how the conference in Ireland would be. It would be wonderful to investigate the roots, the Irish roots of Burton there.